Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 529, The Importance of a Serious Part. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by its listeners. Many thanks and much gratefulness to all of the listeners who have gone over to patreon.com/craftlit and pledged their support to the show. We couldn't do it without you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am well, now that my computer is working. Thursday night we had a thunderstorm shortly after we started our Zoom call. And huge thanks to Mary and Candy and Tracy and Amy for keeping the fun rolling while my computer was rebooting over and over and over. And I couldn't get the phone to connect, and it was fun. So I'm sorry I missed you. I did get the notes from the chat. Thank you, Candy. Thank you, Mary. And you guys seem to have found a whole bunch of stuff to talk about, which is great. And I have all of the books and patterns that we discussed on Tuesday morning for me and Thursday for everybody else in the show notes at craftlit.com/529. Also at craftlit.libsyn.com, where you can always get the podcast, even if iTunes or anywhere else goes south. One of the things that wasn't able to happen last night because I got knocked off by the universe is that listener Jennifer had emailed me during the day to let me know some news. A lot of this is book recommendation news. So I'm going to go ahead and read most of this because it also ends in a very happy little note. And if you haven't joined into one of our Zoom chats so far, this will give you an idea of what kind of stuff we talk about. Let's see. Jennifer said she's just finished The Island of the Mad by Laurie R. King. This is one of her Mary Russell books. I didn't know that there was another Mary Russell out, so I'm excited. She also read Hounded, which is a book that I had brought up. If you like kind of wackily humored fantasy fiction with a druidic bent, there's a book called Hounded. She's read that one, and her comment, which I think we can all appreciate, like, I need another series in my life. And then she said, unfortunately, I like Atticus and Oberon, and we'll have to continue with them. Atticus being the name of a 2,000-year-old druid, and Oberon, his large Irish wolfhound, who can speak a little bit, at least in their heads. So that's fun. And then we got book recommendations from Jennifer's daughters, which I really appreciated. The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea by Maggie Takuda Hall. She said it's a perfectly acceptable summer read. And her daughter also pretty much commanded her to go read The Dark Lord of Dirkholm by Diana Wynne Jones, Wynne. She said she's enjoying it very much. And after she finishes it, she may go on to The Tough Guide to Fantasyland, which is Dark Lord approved, also by Diana Wynne Jones. She noted that she has already read the introduction, which is also known as How to Use This Book, and found it hilarious. So if you're looking for something humorous, there you go. And then her other daughter sent her Consolation Songs. It's an anthology book that's edited by one of her friends, Dat Sharma. This is, and she is quoting, so I am quoting her, optimistic speculative fiction for a time of pandemic. It's kind of a mixed bag of what kind of stories you'll get, but she said the mood of the book and the stories in it are right. All proceeds benefit the COVID-19 appeal run by the University College London Hospitals charity. And then the happy news, this going out specifically to Amy in Seattle. Amy, the name you gave Jennifer's last quilt, Jennifer's Quilt of Many Colors, is now embroidered on the label. It is official. Well done. So that gets everybody up to speed on some of the books that, well, would have gotten discussed last night had I been there. There are more in the show notes, as I said. And we have a voicemail.
Hi, Heather and Craftlit listeners. I'm Carrie Ellis, and I wanted to comment on a couple of things. First of all, a few episodes ago, you talked about Russian authors and keeping the names straight, and I had a chuckle to myself because I have read Anna Karenina, but I listened to it as an audiobook. So I heard the names differently than I would have seen them, and had I attempted to read it visually, I would have been in the same boat. I never would have been able to keep those names straight, but because I heard them differently, I was able to follow along a little better. The next thing I wanted to comment on is about weighted blankets. I think what you're looking for there is called a cat. And the last thing is about the book we're reading now, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. And I just had a small observation about Mr. Huntington's name. And again, hearing it instead of seeing it, I hear it as hunting, and really that's what he's doing. So I thought that was a fun play on words. Thanks. Bye for now.
So, Carrie, interesting insights on Russian novels and listening. Shockingly, for somebody who hosts an audiobook podcast, it hadn't occurred to me that maybe I should go listen to the Russian novels. So that's on my list now. Thank you. And part deux, your insight about Mr. Huntington was perfectly timed. And today you'll see why. I need to dive in. I have a bunch of chapters for you today because I just felt it necessary to get you past the main turning point and through a particular story. I think it will set us up nicely for the rest of the book. There's a few things that I wanted to make sure you were aware of before we dive into the chapters, par normal. So, first off, if you hear a reference to Saint Herbert and Valentine, that's kind of a coded reference to the thing we've seen before, that French kind of medieval era courtly romance stuff. I am using the word stuff pejoratively. This is kind of a scornful reference to, those romances and those romantic types. And you can probably hear the sarcasm dripping from my lips because it's supposed to be there. There's a reference, All for Love or The World Well Lost. This was a play by John Dryden from 1678. It was famous enough at the time to have become a phrase that people used in reference to love. Again, All for Love or The World Well Lost. Kind of the same way we use things like Much Ado About Nothing or All's Well That Ends Well, like that. There is a word, rhodomontade, Rodomontade. This comes from the Old French, and it just means bragging-ish. You'll get it from context now that you've got the word in your head. Rhodomontade, Rodomontade. There's a reference, I have never seen this before, to blacklegs, all one word. I yanked out the compact edition of the Oxford English Dictionary and magnifying glass to make sure I had this right. Blacklegs, they've lost the original reason for the word's meaning. They have, this means that they have references to it from a very long time ago, but they have lost the reason why the words were smashed together, the word black and the word legs. Often we actually do have the reason why two words get smashed together and therefore become something new. This time, not so much. Black legs, in some places, is referred to as a swindler, is someone who is referred to as a blackleg. For example, con men, really, the term is confidence man or a confidence trickster. Here we have blacklegs being referred to as swindlers, but in fact they are a little bit more specific than that. They are turf swindlers. They are people who swindle you out of property. Bedlamites, we have come across this before. Sadly, our history when it comes to people with mental illness has not been so stellar. The Bethlehem Hospital in London was colloquially referred to as Bedlam. Bedlam became a synonym for a whole lot of craziness going on. That's because at Bethlehem Hospital, there were a whole lot of people considered crazies or loonies or bedlamites who were kept there, and it was referred to as a lunatic asylum, not somewhere you wanted to be kept. Fellow to say, I have never come across this. I have no idea how this missed my brain before. Fellow, F-E-L-O hyphen D-E hyphen S-E. Fellow to say literally means felon of the self. This is what you are if you commit suicide, because suicide was illegal. Interesting, right? Felon of yourself, fellow to say. A little side note, just so that you have it in the back of your mind. If you are a member of the peerage, you are a lord or something like that, you cannot be put into debtor's prison back in the day. You could have your lands confiscated for debt, but you couldn't be put into debtor's prison the way we know people were put into debtor's prison, just normal people were put into debtor's prison, for instance, in every Dickens book ever written by Charles Dickens. Somebody wound up going to debtor's prison or some kind of prison. You will hear a reference to somebody being a skeleton at a feast. This is a really interesting way to put it, and I guarantee that somewhere in their lives, the Bronte kids came across this reference in one of the dreadful magazines that they liked to read. A skeleton at a feast is, how can we have fun when you're being a party pooper? How can we have fun when you're a skeleton at a feast? How can we eat and enjoy it if we're looking at you, a skeleton? This is also a reference to something called a memento mori. Remember a memento, a thing that you, mori, remember, that helps you to remember that we're all going to die, that we're all mortal. There are lots of instances in history and literature of memento mori. In fact, recently on the second season of the TV show The Alienist, which if you haven't watched, it's a little uneven. The writing is a little uneven, which is a shame because the book was actually pretty good for a good summer read. You know, there's literature, there's trash, and then there's good trash. I would put this in the upper level of good trash. Came out, oh dear God, 25 years ago? Oh, that's a horror. And it was a while ago. But while the book was excellent and did a beautiful job of painting New York City in the early days when Teddy Roosevelt was a police commissioner and trying to clean the joint up, what they've done with the TV show, even if you just watch it with the volume off, they've done such an extraordinary job of recreating, especially the Lower East Side and the midsection of New York City circa 1902. It is stupendous. I believe they've rebuilt 3 streets that they can dress and redress depending on where they're supposed to be in the city. I think they built it outside Prague. I think they built it in the Czech Republic, but it's remarkable. And all of the making of videos are, to me, almost more interesting than the TV show. I believe this is on TNT. The first and second episodes of the second season specifically deal with memento mori. So it's in the air right now. I also thought it was kind of interesting. The skeleton at a feast idea parallels something that we do at Passover, which is during what is a celebratory dinner, celebrating having stayed alive all this time, and using this festival dinner to retell the story of the exodus from Egypt and from slavery to moving from slavery to being a free people. One of the parts of the story that you obviously have to get to is the plagues that were sent to Egypt. And of course, especially the final plague, the death of the firstborn children, which is where the story of Jews taking lamb's blood and painting the lintels, the doorposts of their home with this blood so that the angel of death would pass over them, pass over their homes. This is how you get Passover. In Hebrew, the holiday is called Pesach. And in Christianity, you have the Paschal Lamb. These things are all related to each other. If you've never seen the movie, the animated movie, The Prince of Egypt, two of the eeriest scenes I have ever seen done in animation appear there. One is when Moses finds the burning bush, beautifully, brilliantly done. And the second is when the angel of death hits Egypt. It is, I'm getting chills, is what's happening right now here in the room where I am. Anyway, Passover dinner, you get to the story of the plagues. And one of the things that you're supposed to do during the night is have 4 glasses of wine. And they happen at specific times during the reading of the Haggadah, basically the script for the dinner. When you get to the plagues, it's just not right to be feeling happy and celebratory when you are talking about so much pain and destruction being set upon a people. Whether they are your people or not, it is not okay to have, and I'm using air quotes here, to have full cups of wine, to have complete joy and enjoyment and joyfulness when something this serious and completely and utterly tragic befalls anyone. This goes along with Martin Luther King. If anyone is persecuted, is kept down, is trodden upon, none of us are unaffected by that in a negative way. And so on Passover, you take your finger and you put it in the wine and you spill drops of wine onto your plate as you recite the names of the plagues in Hebrew, Dam Sephardiah, and you go through all 10 of them until you get to the death of the firstborn children. And it is amazing how that moment transforms the rest of the meal. Just that memento mori, that memory that we are all mortal, that we will all die, that the world will go on without us, and that how can you enjoy life if you don't recognize that death will eventually show up for us? Like in The Sandman on Audible now with James McAvoy. Oh my gosh. The corollary to all of this is listen in this chapter, in the chapters today, to who is saying this guy was like a skeleton at a feast. And I am sure you will realize why this particular group of people don't want to have to remember that we're all mortal and that there will be a day of reckoning coming. It makes a lot of sense when you get there. You'll hear a reference to somebody sneaking in like the ghost in Macbeth. This is the Act 3, Scene 4, Banquo's ghost moment when Macbeth sees, in his mind anyway, perhaps, the ghost of Banquo come in to let him know that all is not well. If you haven't listened to Aaron Ziegler's Macbeth from many years ago, please go listen to it. He did such a beautiful job with Macbeth. Oh, so good. Laudanum. You knew it was coming. You knew it had to show up in this book. Laudanum. If you are not familiar with it, people used to be able to get bottles of laudanum, which was a narcotic. It was a painkiller. It was an opiate. It was morphine-ish. You drank it. You didn't inject it. It was used sometimes kind of like how we would use Valium or Xanax now. But obviously, since it was an opiate, not so good in the long run if you took it too much. Long Day's Journey into Night is a long, really long play and a movie about an opium addiction. If you've ever seen anyone in the hospital who is on a morphine drip and semi-conscious, I guess, you may have seen them in a kind of a morphine haze where they're not with us. They're not here in this world. They are absolutely somewhere else and responding to what they're seeing and hearing in somewhere else. It is eerie, and it's got to be hard to be in the middle of too, because whatever it is that they're seeing and hearing is clearly very real to them. And that would have been a weird thing for people to have seen back in 1830. There are references to two related phrases, one in Latin and one in French. Media via, which you can probably guess. Media, middle, via, way. The middle way. This is the middle path. This is, I believe Buddhism has a middle way as well. There is also a French phrase, which I'd never come across before, but I like this. It is ni jamais, ni toujours. It is neither never nor always. Just like anybody who says, oh, it's always this or it's always that, or I'm never this or I'm never that, you know they're wrong because nothing is either always nor never. I thought I invented that. No, I didn't. But it was kind of interesting to see that there's an old French phrase, ni jamais, ni toujours, neither never nor always. You will hear the phrase castaway used. This is serious. This is not castaway like Wilson and Tom Hanks on an island. This is castaway as in cast away from God. This is, you are now God's reject. God ain't gonna look at you no more. Being a castaway, I thought just from context that we were talking about, like, I don't know, a metaphoric orphan, which I suppose is kind of true, but it's way more serious than that. So when you hear it, let your ears prick up, because yikes. I learned that the word enthusiast actually means something more than somebody who's enthusiastic about something. It actually comes from the Greek, and it means filled with the God. So if you are enthusiastic about something, you are like ecstatic, like religious ecstasy. You are filled with the Spirit. I like that. Listen for more phrenology. I know that is going to horrify some of you. There are going to be two references today to phrenology, both about the same person, both about the same part of the body. And finally, if you are familiar with the book of Ecclesiastes, you are going to hear a dumpster load of Ecclesiastes flung at you in the last part of our last chapter today. If you are not familiar with Ecclesiastes, I'm going to do a far too quick and far too lightweight rundown of it, but I think it will help. Book of Ecclesiastes, written by Solomon, proverbs, sayings, words to live by. It's largely autobiographical. He wrote it late in life, somewhere around maybe 935 before Common Era. He realized he'd probably not been so perfect and wanted to share his hard-won wisdom with everybody. So chapters 1 and 2 are his, here are all the ways that I was selfish and going after pleasure and not paying attention, not keeping a memento mori nearby to remind me that all flesh is grass. Then he goes on in chapters 3 through 5 to give some of his wisdom, his observations on life, like as he had come naked from his mother's womb, so will he return, that kind of thing. And then chapters 6 through 8, you kind of have his Marcus Aurelius moment where he gives his advice for how to have a meaningful life. And then chapters 9 through 12, he concludes by reminding us we're all going to die, and anything we're trying to do here for ourselves is vanity / basically useless, that you need to pay attention to God, keep his commandments. This is how to have a good life. Love your parents, obey your parents, don't kill anybody, don't steal. This is how to have a good life. You will not be surprised when I tell you that one character tends to draw their quote unquote biblical wisdom from the earlier chapters where Solomon talks about how much fun he'd had in his early part of his life, and that other words of wisdom are drawn from later in the book, more about the memento mori and how to live a good and meaningful life. And I'll bet you can guess who's going to be using which parts of that book as part of their argument making. Okay, that was a lot. So, chapters 21, 22, and 23 of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, read for us by Maya Daguerre. Here we go.
Chapter 21, Opinions. October 1st. All is settled now. My father has given his consent, and the time is fixed for Christmas, by a sort of compromise between the respective advocates for hurry and delay. Millicent Hargrave is to be one bridesmaid, and Annabella Wilmot the other. Not that I'm particularly fond of the latter, but she is an intimate of the family, and I have not another friend. When I told Millicent of my engagement, she rather provoked me by her manner of taking it. After staring a moment in mute surprise, she said, "Well, Helen, I suppose I ought to congratulate you, and I am glad to see you so happy, but I did not think you would take him, and I can't help feeling surprised that you should like him so much." "But why?" "Because you are so superior to him in every way, and there's something so bold and reckless about him. So I don't know how, but I always feel a wish to get out of his way when I see him approach." "You are timid, Millicent, but that's no fault of his. And then his look," continued she. "People say he is handsome, and of course he is, but I don't like that kind of beauty. I wonder that you should." "Why so, pray?" "Well, you know, I think there's nothing noble or lofty in his appearance. In fact, you wonder that I can like anyone so unlike the stilted heroes of romance. Well, give me a flesh and blood lover, and I'll leave all the Sir Herberts and Valentines to you, if you can find them." "I don't want them," said she. "I'll be satisfied with flesh and blood too, only the spirit must shine through and predominate. But don't you think Mr. Huntington's face is too red?" "No," cried I indignantly. "It is not red at all. There's just a pleasant glow, a healthy freshness in his complexion, the warm pinky tint of the whole harmonizing with the deeper colours of the cheeks, exactly as it ought to. I hate a man to be red and white like a painted doll, or all sickly white or smoky black or cadaverous yellow." "Well, tastes differ, but I like pale or dark," replied she. "But to tell you the truth, Helen, I've been deluding myself with the hope that you would one day be my sister. I expected Walter would be introduced to you next season, and I thought that you would like him, and was certain he would like you. And I flattered myself I should thus have the felicity of seeing the two persons I like best in the world, except Mamma, united in one. He mayn't be exactly what you would call handsome, but he's far more distinguished looking and nicer and better than Mr. Huntington, and I'm sure you would say so if you knew him." "Impossible, Millicent. You think so because you're his sister, and on that account I'll forgive you. But nobody else should so disparage Arthur Huntington to me with impunity." Miss Wilmot expressed her feelings on the subject almost as openly. "And so, Helen," said she, coming up to me with a smile of no amiable import, "you are to be Mrs. Huntington, I suppose?" "Yes," replied I. "Don't you envy me?" "Oh dear, no," she exclaimed. "I shall probably be Lady Lowborough some day, and then, you know, dear, I shall be in the capacity to inquire, 'Don't you envy me?'" "Henceforth I shall envy no one," returned I. "Indeed, are you so happy then?" she said thoughtfully, and something very like a cloud of disappointment shadowed her face. "And does he love you? I mean, does he idolize you as much as you do him?" she added, fixing her eyes upon me with ill-disguised anxiety for the reply. "I don't want to be idolized," I answered, "but I am well assured that he loves me more than anybody else in the world, as I do him." "Exactly," she said with a nod. "I wish—" She paused. "What do you wish?" asked I, annoyed with the vindictive expression of her countenance. "I wish," returned she, with a short laugh, that all the attractive points and desirable qualifications of the two gentlemen were united in one, that Lord Loughborough had Huntington's handsome face and good temper, and all his wit and mirth and charm, or else that Huntington had Loughborough's pedigree and title and delightful old family seat, and I had him, and you might have the other unwelcome. Thank you, dear Annabella. I am better satisfied with things as they are for my own part, and for you I wish you were as well content with your intended as I am with mine, said I. And it was true enough, for though vexed at first at her unamiable spirit, her frankness touched me, and the contrast between our situations was such that I could well afford to pity her and wish her well. Mr. Huntington's acquaintances appeared to be no better pleased with our approaching union than mine. This morning's post brought him letters from several of his friends, during the perusal of which, at the breakfast table, he excited the attention of the company by the singular variety of his grimaces. But he crushed them all into his pocket with a private laugh, and said nothing until the meal was concluded. Then, while the company were hanging over the fire, or loitering through the room, previous to settling to their various morning avocations, he came and leant over the back of my chair, with his face in contact with my curls, and commencing with a quiet little kiss, poured forth the following complaints into my ear. Helen, you witch, do know that you've entailed upon me the curses of all my friends. I wrote to them the other day to tell them of my happy prospects, and now, instead of a bundle of congratulations, I've got a pocket full of bitter execrations and reproaches. There's not one kind wish for me, or one good word for you among them all. They say there'll be no more fun now, and no more merry days and glorious nights, and it's all my fault. I'm the first to break up this jovial band, and the others, in pure despair, will follow my example. I was the very life and prop of the community, they do me the honour to say, and I have shamefully betrayed my trust. You may join them again if you like, said I, somewhat piqued at the sorrowful tone of his discourse. I should be sorry to stand between any man or body of men and so much happiness, and perhaps I can manage to do without you as well as your poor deserted friends. Bless you, no, murmured he. It's all for love or the world well lost with me. Let them go to where they belong, so to speak politely. But if you saw how they abused me, Helen, you would love me all the more for having ventured so much for your sake. He pulled out his crumpled letters. I thought he was going to show them to me, and I told him I did not wish to see them. I'm not going to show them to you, love, said he. They're hardly fit for a lady's eyes, the most part of them. But look here, this is Grimsby's scrawl. Only 3 lines, the sulky dog. He doesn't say much, to be sure, but his very silence implies more than the other's words, and the less he says, the more he thinks. God damn him. I beg your pardon, dearest. And this is Hargrave's missive. He is particularly grieved at me because, forsooth, he had fallen in love with you from his sister's reports, and meant to have married you himself as soon as he had sowed his wild oats. I'm vastly obliged to him, observed I. And so am I, said he. And look at this. This is Hattersley's. Every page stuffed full of railing accusations, bitter curses, and lamentable complaints, ending up with swearing that he'll be getting married himself in revenge. He'll throw himself away on the first old maid that chooses to set her cap at him. As if I cared what he did with himself. Well, said I, if you give up your intimacy with these men, I don't think you'll have much cause to regret the loss of their society, for it's my belief that they never did you much good. Maybe not, but we'd a merry time of it too, though mingled with the sorrow and pain. As Loughborough knows to his costs, ha ha! And while he was laughing at the recollections of Loughborough's troubles, my uncle came and clapped him on the shoulder. Come, my lad, said he, are you too busy making love to my niece to make war with the pheasants? 1st of October, remember. Sun shines out, rain ceased. Even Boreham's not afraid to venture in his waterproof boots, and Wilmot and I are going to beat you all. I declare we old uns are the keenest sportsmen of the lot. I'll show you what I can do today, however, said my companion. I'll murder your birds by wholesale, just for keeping me away from better company than either of you or them. And so saying, he departed, and I saw no more of him till dinner. It seemed a very weary time. I wonder what I shall do without him. It is very true that the 3 elder gentlemen have proved themselves much keener sportsmen than the 2 younger ones, for both Lord Loughborough and Arthur Huntington have of late almost daily neglected the shooting excursions to accompany us in our various rides and rambles. But these merry times are fast drawing to a close. In less than a fortnight the party breaks up, much to my sorrow, for every day I enjoy it more and more. Now that Mrs. Boreham and Wilmot have ceased to tease me, and my aunt has ceased to lecture me, and I have ceased to be jealous of Annabella, and even to dislike her, and now that Mr. Huntington is become my Arthur, and I may enjoy his society without restraint, what shall I do without him, I repeat. Chapter 22. Traits of Friendship. October 5th. My cup of sweets is not unmingled. It is dashed with a bitterness that I cannot hide from myself, disguise it as I will. I may try to persuade myself that the sweetness overpowers it. I may call it a pleasant aromatic flavour, but say what I will, it is still there, and I cannot but taste it. I cannot shut my eyes to Arthur's faults, and the more I love him, the more they trouble me. His very heart, that I trusted so, is, I fear, less warm and generous than I thought it. At least he gave me a specimen of his character today that seemed to merit a harder name than thoughtlessness. He and Lord Loughborough were accompanying Annabella and me in a long delightful ride. He was riding by my side as usual, and Annabella and Lord Loughborough were a little before us, the latter bending towards his companion as if in tender confidential discourse. "Those two will get the start of us, Helen, if we don't look sharp," observed Huntington. "They'll make a match of it, as sure can be. That Loughborough's fairly besotted, but he'll find himself in a fix when he's got her, I doubt." "And she'll find herself in a fix when she's got him," said I, "if what I've heard of him is true." "Not a bit of it. She knows what she's about. But if he, the poor fool, deludes himself with the notion that she'll make him a good wife, and bemused him with some rhodomontade about despising rank and wealth in matters of love and marriage, he flatters himself that she's devotedly attached to him, and that she will not refuse him for his poverty, and does not court him for his rank, but loves him for himself alone." "But is he not courting her for her fortune?" "No, not he. That was the first attraction, certainly, but now he has quite lost sight of it. It never enters into his calculations, except merely as an essential, without which, for the lady's own sake, he could not think of marrying her. No, he's fairly in love. He thought he never could be again, but he's in for it once more. He was to have married before, some 2 or 3 years ago, but he lost his bride by losing his fortune. He got into a bad way among us in London, and had an unfortunate taste for gambling, and surely the fellow was born under an unlucky star, for he always lost thrice where he gained once. That's a mode of self-torment I never was much addicted to. When I spend my money, I like to enjoy the full value of it. I see no fun in wasting it on thieves and blackguards. And as for gaining money, hitherto I have always had sufficient. It's time enough to be clutching for more, I think, when you begin to see the end of what you have. But I have sometimes frequented the gaming houses just to watch the ongoings of those mad votaries of chance. Very interesting study, I assure you, Helen, and sometimes very diverting. I've had many a laugh at the boobies and bedlamites. Loughborough was quite infatuated, not willingly, but of necessity. He was always resolving to give it up, and always breaking his resolution. Every venture was just once more. If he gained a little, he hoped to gain a little more next time, and if he lost, it would not do to leave off that juncture. He must go on until he had retrieved that last misfortune at least. Bad luck could not last forever, and every lucky hit was looked upon as a dawn of better times, till experience proved the contrary. At length he grew desperate, and we were daily on the lookout for a case of felo de se. No great matter, some of us whispered, as his existence had ceased to be an acquisition to our club. At last, however, he came to a check. He made a large stake, which he had determined should be the last, whether he lost or won. He had often so determined before, to be sure, and had as often broken his determination, and so it was this time. He lost, and while his antagonist smilingly swept away the stakes, he turned chalky white, drew back in silence, and wiped his forehead. I was present at the time, and while he stood with folded arms and eyes fixed on the ground, I knew well enough what was passing in his mind. "Is it to be the last, Loughborough?" said I, stepping up to him. "The last but one," he answered with a grim smile, and then rushing back to the table, he struck his hand upon it, Raising his voice above all the confusion of jingling coins and muttered oaths and curses in the room, he swore a deep and solemn oath that, come what would, this trial should be the last, and imprecated unspeakable curses on his head if he should ever shuffle a card or rattle a dice box again. He then doubled his former stake and challenged anyone present to play against him. Grimsby instantly presented himself. Lowborough glared fiercely at him, for Grimsby was almost as celebrated for his luck as he was for his ill fortune. However, they fell to work. But Grimsby had much skill and little scruple, and whether he took advantage of the other's trembling, blinded eagerness to deal unfairly by him, I cannot undertake to say. But Lowborough lost again, and fell dead sick. "You'd better try once more," said Grimsby, leaning across the table, and then he winked at me. "I've nothing to try with," said the poor devil with a ghastly smile. "Oh, Huntington will lend you what you want," said the other. "No, you heard my oath," answered Lowborough, turning away in quiet despair, and I took him by the arm and led him out. "Is this to be the last, Lowborough?" I asked when I got him into the street. "The last," he answered, somewhat against my expectation, and I took him home. That is, to our club, for he was as submissive as a child, and plied him with brandy and water till he began to look rather brighter, rather more alive at least. "Huntington, I'm ruined," he said, taking the third glass from my hand. He had drunk the others in dead silence. "Not you," said I. "You'll find a man can live without his money as merrily as a tortoise without its head, or a wasp without its body." "But I'm in debt," said he, "deep in debt, and I can never, never get out of it." "Well, what of that? Many a better man than you has lived and died in debt, and they can't put you in prison, you know, because you're a peer." And I handed him his fourth tumbler. "But I hate to be in debt," he shouted. "I wasn't born for it, and I cannot bear it." "What cannot cured must be endured," said I, beginning to mix the fifth. "And then I've lost my Caroline." And he began to snivel, for the brandy had softened his heart. "No matter," I answered. "There are more Carolines in the world than one." "There's only one for me," he replied with a dolorous sigh. "And if there were 50 more, who's to get them, I wonder, without money?" "Oh, somebody will take you for your title, and then you've your family estate yet. That's entailed, you know." "I wish to God I could sell it to pay my debts," he muttered. "And then," said Grimsby, who had just come in, "you could try again, you know. I would have one more chance if I were you. I'd never stop here." "I won't, I tell you," shouted he, and he started up and left the room, walking rather unsteadily, for the liquor had gone to his head. He was not so much used to it then, but after that he took to it kindly to solace his cares. He kept his oath about gambling, not a little to the surprise of us all, though Grimsby did his utmost to tempt him to break it. But now he had got hold of another habit that bothered him nearly as much, for he soon discovered that the demon of drink was as black as the demon of play, and nearly as hard to get rid of, especially as his kind friends did all they could to second the promptings of his own insatiable cravings. "Then they were demons themselves," cried I, unable to contain my indignation. "And you, Mr. Huntington, it seems, were the first to tempt him." "Well, what could we do?" replied he depreciatingly. "We meant it in kindness. We couldn't bear to see the poor fellow so miserable, and besides, he was such a damper upon us, sitting there silent and glum, when he was under the threefold influence of the loss of his sweetheart, the loss of his fortune, and the reaction of the last night's debauch. Whereas, when he'd had something in him, if he was not merry himself, he was an unfailing source of merriment to us. Even Grimsby could chuckle over his odd sayings. They delighted him far more than my merry jests or Hattersley's riotous mirth. But one evening, when we were sitting over our wine, after one of our club dinners, and had all been hearty together, Lowborough giving us mad toasts, and hearing our wild songs, and bearing a hand in the applause, if he did not help us to sing them himself, he suddenly relapsed into silence, sinking his head on his hand, and never lifting his glass to his lips. But this was nothing new, so we let him alone and went on with our jollification, till suddenly, raising his head, he interrupted us in the middle of a roar of laughter by exclaiming, "Gentlemen, where is this all to end? Will you just tell me that now? Where is it all to end?" "In hell-fire," growled Grimsby. "You've hit it, I thought so," cried he. "Well then, I tell you what." He rose. A speech, shouted we. "Hear, hear, Lowborough's going to give us a speech." He waited calmly till the thunders of applause and jingling of glasses had ceased, and then proceeded. "It's only this, gentlemen, that I think we better go no farther. We better just stop while we can." "Just so," cried Hattersley. "Stop, poor sinner, stop and think before you farther go. No longer sport upon the brink of everlasting woe." "Exactly," replied his lordship, with the utmost gravity. "And if you choose to visit the bottomless pit, I won't go with you. We must part company, for I swear I'll not move another step towards it. What's this?" he said, taking up his glass of wine. "Taste it," suggested I. "This is hell broth," he exclaimed. "I renounce it forever." And he threw it out into the middle of the table. "Fill it again," said I, handing him the bottle, "and let us drink to your renunciation." "It's rank poison," said he, grasping the bottle by the neck, "and I forswear it. I've given up gambling, and I'll give up this too." He was on the point of deliberately pouring the whole contents of the bottle onto the table, but Hargrave wrested it from him. "On you be the curse, then," said he, and backing from the room, he shouted, "Farewell, ye tempters," and vanished amid shouts of laughter and applause. We expected him back amongst us the next day, but to our surprise the place remained vacant. We saw nothing of him for a whole week, and we really began to think he was going to keep his word. At last, one evening, when we were most of us assembled together again, he entered, silent and grim as a ghost, and would have quietly slipped into his usual seat at my elbow, but we all rose to welcome him, and several voices were raised to ask what he would have, and several hands were busy with a bottle and glass to serve him. But I knew a smoking tumbler of brandy and water would comfort him best, and had nearly prepared it when he peevishly pushed it away, saying, "Do let me alone, Huntington. Do be quiet, all of you. I'm not come to join you. I'm only come to be with you a while, because I can't bear my own thoughts." And he folded his arms and leant back in his chair. So we let him be, but I left the glass by him, and after a while Grimsby directed my attention towards it by a significant wink, and on turning my head I saw it was drained to the bottom. He made me a sign to replenish and quietly pushed up the bottle. I willingly complied, but Lowborough detected the pantomime and, nettled at the intelligent grins that were passing between us, snatched the glass from my hands and dashed the contents of it in Grimsby's face, threw the empty tumbler at me, and then bolted from the room. "I hope he broke your head," said I. "No, love," replied he, laughing immoderately at the recollection of the whole affair. "He would have done so, and perhaps spoilt my face too, but providentially this forest of curls," taking off his hat and showing his luxurious chestnut locks, "saved my skull and prevented the glass from breaking till it reached the table. After that," he continued, "Lowborough kept aloof from us a week or two longer. I used to meet him occasionally in the town, and then, as I was too good-natured to resent his unmannerly conduct, he bore no malice against me. He was never unwilling to talk to me. On the contrary, he would cling to me and follow me anywhere. But to the club and the gaming houses and such like dangerous places of resort, he was so weary of his own moping, melancholy mind. At last I got him to come with me to the club on condition that I would not tempt him to drink, and for some time he continued to look in upon us pretty regularly of an evening, still abstaining with wonderful perseverance from the rank poison he had so bravely forsworn. But some of our members protested against this conduct. They did not like to have him sitting there like a skeleton at the feast, instead of contributing his quota to the general amusement and casting a cloud over all, and watching with greedy eyes every drop they carried to their lips. They vowed it was not fair, and some of them maintained that he should either be compelled to do as others did, or expelled from the society, and swore that next time he showed himself they would tell him as much, and if he did not take the warning, proceed to active measures. However, I befriended him on this occasion, and recommended them to let him be for a while, intimating that with a little patience on our part he would soon come round again. But to be sure it was rather provoking, for though he refused to drink like an honest Christian, it was well known to me that he kept a private bottle of laudanum about him, which he was continually soaking at, or rather holding off and on with, abstaining one day and exceeding the next, just like the spirits. One night, however, during one of our orgies, one of our high festivals, he glided in like the ghost in Macbeth and seated himself as usual, a little back from the table, in the chair we always placed for the spectre, whether it chose to fill it or not. I saw by his face that he was suffering from the effects of an overdose of his insidious comforter, but nobody spoke to him, and he spoke to nobody. A few sidelong glances and a whispered observation that the ghost was come was all the notice that he drew by his appearance. And we went on with our merry carousals as before, till he startled us all by suddenly drawing in his chair and leaning forward with his elbows on the table, and exclaiming with portentous solemnity, "Well, it puzzles me what you can find to be so merry about. What you see in life I don't know. I see only blackness of darkness and the fearful looking for of judgment and fiery indignation." All the company simultaneously pushed up their glasses to him, and I set them before him in a semicircle, and tenderly patting him on the back, bid him drink, and he would soon see a brighter prospect as any of us. But he pushed them back, muttering, "Take them away, I won't taste it, I tell you, I won't. So I handed them down again to the owners, but I saw that he followed them with a glare of hungry regret as they departed. Then he clasped his hands before his eyes to shut out the sight, and 2 minutes after lifted his head again and said in a hoarse but vehement whisper, "And yet I must, Huntington. Get me a glass." "Take the bottle, man," said I, thrusting the brandy bottle into his hand. "But stop, I'm telling too much," muttered the narrator, startled at the look I turned upon him. "But no matter," he recklessly added, and thus continued his relation. In his desperate eagerness, he seized the bottle and sucked away, till he suddenly dropped from his chair and, disappearing under the table amidst a tempest of applause, the consequence of this imprudence was something like an apoplectic fit, followed by a rather severe brain fever. "And what did you think of yourself, sir?" said I quickly. "Of course I was very penitent," he replied. "I went to see him once or twice, nay, twice or thrice, or by a lady some 4 times, and when he got better I tenderly brought him back to the fold." "What do you mean?" "I mean I restored him to the bosom of the club, and compassionating the feebleness of his health and the extreme lowness of his spirits, I recommended him to take a little wine for his stomach's sake, and when he was sufficiently re-established, to embrace the media via ni jamais ni toujours plan, not to kill himself like a fool and not abstain like a ninny. In a word, to enjoy himself like a rational creature, and do as I did. For don't think, Helen, that I'm a tippler. I'm nothing at all of that kind, and never was, and never shall be. I value my comfort far too much. I see that a man cannot give himself up to drinking without being miserable one half of his days and mad the other. Besides, I like to enjoy my life at all sides and ends, which cannot be done by one that suffers himself to be the slave of a single propensity. And moreover, drinking spoils one's good looks," he concluded, with a most conceited smile that ought to have provoked me more than it did. "And did Lord Loughborough profit by your advice?" I asked. "Why, yes, in a manner. For a while he managed very well indeed. He was a model of moderation and prudence, something too much so for the taste of our wild community. But somehow Loughborough had not the gift of moderation. If he stumbled a little to one side, he must go down before he could right himself. If he overshot the mark one night, the effects of it rendered him so miserable the next day that he must repeat the offence to mend it, and so on, from day to day, till his clamorous conscience brought him to a stand. And then, in his sober moments, he so bothered his friends with his remorse and his terrors and woes that they were obliged in self-defence to get him to drown his sorrows in wine, or any more potent beverage that came to hand. And when his first scruples of conscience were overcome, he would need no more persuading. He would often grow desperate, and be as great a blackguard as any of them could desire, but only to lament his own unutterable wickedness and degradation the more when the fit was over. At last one day, when he and I were alone together, after pondering a while in one of his gloomy, abstracted moods, with his arms folded and his head sunk on his breast, he suddenly woke up, and vehemently grasping my arm, said, "Huntington, this won't do. I'm resolved to have done with it." "What, are you going to shoot yourself?" said I. "No, I'm going to reform." "Oh, that's nothing new. You've been going to reform these 12 months and more." "Yes, but you wouldn't let me, and I was such a fool. I couldn't live without you. But now I see what it is that keeps me back, and what's wanted to save me, and I'd compass sea and land to get it, only I'm afraid there's no chance." And he sighed as if his heart would break. "What is it, Loughborough?" said I, thinking he was fairly cracked at last. "A wife," he answered, For I cannot live alone, because my own mind distracts me, and I cannot live with you, because you take the devil's part against me." "Who, I?" "Yes, all of you do, and you more than any of them, you know. But if I could get a wife, with a fortune enough to pay off my debts and set me straight in the world—" "To be sure," said I. "And sweetness and goodness enough," he continued, "to make home tolerable, and to reconcile me to myself, I think I should do it yet. I shall never be in love again, that's certain, but perhaps that would be no great matter. It would enable me to choose with my eyes open, and I should make a good husband in spite of it. But could anyone be in love with me? That's the question. With your good looks and powers of fascination," he was pleased to say, "I might hope, but as it is, Huntington, do you think anybody would take me, ruined and wretched as I am?" "Yes, certainly." "Who?" "Why, any neglected old maid, fast sinking in despair, would be delighted to." "No, no," said he, "it must be someone I can love." "Why, you just said you could never be in love again." "Well, love is not the word, but somebody that I can like." "I'll search all England through, at all events," he cried, with a sudden burst of hope or desperation. "Succeed or fail, it will be better than rushing headlong to destruction at that damned club. So farewell to it and you. Whenever I meet you on honest ground or under a Christian roof, I shall be glad to see you, but never more shall you entice me to that devil's den." This was shameful language, but I shook hands with him and we parted. He kept his word, and from that time forward he has been a pattern of propriety as far as I can tell, but till lately I've not had very much to do with him. He occasionally sought my company, but as frequently shrunk from it, fearing lest I should wile him back to destruction, and I found him not very entertaining, especially as he sometimes attempted to awaken my conscience and draw me from the perdition that he considered himself to have escaped. But when I did happen to meet him, I seldom failed to ask after the progress of his matrimonial efforts and researches, and in general he could give me but a poor account. The mothers were repelled by his empty coffers and his reputation for gambling, and the daughters by his cloudy brow and melancholy temper. Besides, he didn't understand them. He wanted the spirit and assurance to carry his point. I left him at it when I went to the Continent, and on my return at the year's end I found him still a disconsolate bachelor, though certainly looking somewhat less like an unblessed exile from the tomb than before. The young ladies had ceased to be afraid of him, and were beginning to think him quite interesting, but the mammas were still unrelenting. It was about this time, Helen, that my good angel brought me into conjunction with you, and then I had eyes and ears for nobody else. But meantime Loughborough became acquainted with our charming friend Miss Wilmot. Through the intervention of his good angel, no doubt he would tell you, though he did not dare to fix his hopes on one so courted and admired till after they were brought into closer contact here at Stanningley, and she, in the absence of her other admirers, indubitably courted his notice, and held out every encouragement to his timid advances. Then indeed he began to hope for a dawn of brighter days, and if for a while I darkened his prospects by standing between him and his son, and so nearly plunged him again into the abyss of despair, it only intensified his ardour and strengthened his hopes when I chose to abandon the field in the pursuit of a brighter treasure. In a word, as I told you, he is fairly besotted. At first he could dimly perceive her faults, and they gave him considerable uneasiness, but now his passion and her art together have blinded him to everything but her perfections and his amazing good fortune. Last night he came to me brimful of his new-found felicity. "Huntington, I'm not a castaway," said he, seizing my hand and squeezing it like a vice. "There is happiness in store for me yet, even in this life. She loves me." "Indeed?" said I. "Has she told you so?" "No, but I can no longer doubt it. Do you not see how pointedly kind and affectionate she is? And she knows the utmost extent of my poverty and cares nothing about it. She knows all the folly, all the wickedness of my former life, and she's not afraid to trust me. My rank and title are no allurements to her, for them she utterly disregards. She is the most generous, high-minded being that can be conceived of. She will save me body and soul from destruction. Already she has ennobled me in my own estimation, and made me 3 times better, wiser, greater than I was. Oh, if I'd but known her before, how much degradation and misery should I have been spared! But what have I done to deserve so magnificent a creature?" And the cream of the jest, continued Mr. Huntington, laughing, is that the artful minx loves nothing about him but his title and pedigree and the delightful old family seat. How do you know? Said I. She told me so herself. She said, as for the man himself, I thoroughly despise him, but then I suppose it's time to be making my choice, and if I waited for someone capable of eliciting my esteem and affection, I should have to pass my life in single blessedness, for I detest you all. I suspect she was wrong there, but however, it's evident that she has no love for him, poor fellow. Then you ought to tell him so. What, and spoil all her plans and prospects, poor girl? No, that would be a breach of confidence, wouldn't it, Helen? Besides, it would break his heart. And he laughed again. Well, Mr. Huntington, I don't know what you see so amazingly diverting in the matter. I see nothing to laugh at. I'm laughing at you just now, love, said he, redoubling his cachications. And leaving him to enjoy his merriment alone, I touched Ruby with the whip and cantered on to rejoin our companions, for we had been walking our horses all this time and were consequently a long way behind. Arthur was soon at my side again, but not disposed to talk to him, I broke into a gallop. He did the same, and we did not slacken our pace till we came up with Miss Wilmot and Lord Loughborough, which was within 1/2 mile of the park gates. I avoided all further conversation with him till we came to the end of our ride, when I meant to jump off my horse and vanish into the house before he could offer his assistance. But while I was disengaging my habit from the crutch, he lifted me off and held me by both hands, asserting that he would not let me go till I had forgiven him. I have nothing to forgive, said I. You have not injured me. No, darling, God forbid that I should, but you are angry, because it was to me that Annabella confessed her lack of esteem for her lover. No, Arthur, it is not that displeases me. It is the whole system of your conduct towards your friend, and if you wish me to forget it, go now and tell him what sort of woman that is, that he adores so madly, and on whom he has hung his hopes of future happiness. I tell you, Helen, that would break his heart. It would be the death of him. Besides, being a scandalous trick to poor Annabella, there is no help for him now. He's past praying for. Besides, she may keep up the deception to the end of the chapter, and then he will be just as happy in the illusion as if it were reality. Or perhaps he will only discover his mistake when he has ceased to love her, and if not, it's much better that the truth should dawn gradually upon him. So now, my angel, I hope I've made out a clear case and fully convinced you that I cannot make the atonement that you require. What other requisition have you to make? Speak, and I will gladly obey. I have none but this, said I, as gravely as before, that in future you will never make a jest of the sufferings of others, and always use your influence with your friends for their own advantage against their evil propensities, instead of seconding their evil propensities against themselves. I will do my utmost, said he, to remember and perform the injunctions of my angel monitress. And after kissing both of my gloved hands, he let me go. When I entered my room, I was surprised to see Annabella Wilmot standing before my toilet table, composedly surveying her features in the glass, with one hand flirting her gold-mounted whip, the other holding up her long habit. She certainly is a magnificent creature, thought I, as I beheld that tall, finely developed figure and the reflection of the handsome face in the mirror before me, with the glossy dark hair, slightly and not ungracefully disordered by the breezy ride, the rich brown complexion glowing with exercise, and the black eyes sparkling with unwonted brilliance. On perceiving me, she turned round, exclaiming, with a laugh that savoured more of malice than mirth, "Why, Helen, what have you been doing so long? I came to tell you my good fortune," she continued, regardless of Rachel's presence. "Lord Loughborough has proposed, and I have been graciously pleased to accept him. Don't you envy me, dear?" "No, love," said I. "Or him either," I mentally added. "And do you like him, Annabella?" "Like him? Yes, to be sure. Over head and ears in love." "Well, I hope you'll make him a good wife." "Thank you, my dear. And what besides do you hope?" "I hope that you will both love each other and both be happy." "Thanks, and I hope you will make a very good wife to Mr. Huntington," said she with a queenly bow, and retired. "Oh, miss, how could you say so to her?" cried Rachel. "Say what?" I replied. Why, that you hope she would make him a good wife. I never heard such a thing. Because I do hope it, or rather I wish it. She is almost past hope. Well, said she, I'm sure I hope he'll make her a good husband. They tell queer things about him downstairs. They were saying, I know, Rachel, I've heard all about him, but he's reformed now, and they've no business to tell tales about their masters. No, Mum, or else they have said some things about Mr. Huntington too. I won't hear them, Rachel. They tell lies. Yes, Mum, she said quietly, and she went on arranging my hair. Do you believe them, Rachel? I asked after a short pause. No, miss, not at all. You know, when a lot of servants get together, they like to talk about their betters, and some for a bit of swagger likes to make it appear as though they knew more than they do, and to throw out hints and things just to astonish the others. But I think that if I was you, Miss Helen, I'd look very well before I leaped. I do believe a young lady can't be too careful who she marries. Of course not, said I. But quick, will you, Rachel? I want to be dressed. And indeed I was anxious to be rid of the good woman, for I was in such a melancholy frame I could hardly keep the tears out of my eyes while she dressed me. It was not for Lord Loughborough, and it was not for Annabella. It was not for myself. It was for Arthur Huntington that they rose. 13th. They are gone, and he is gone. We're to be parted for more than 2 months, above 10 weeks. A long, long time to live and not to see him. But he has promised to write often, and made me promise to write still oftener, because he will be busily settling his affairs, and I shall have nothing better to do. Well, I think I should always have plenty to say, but oh, for the time when we should always be together, and can exchange our thoughts without the intervention of these cold go-betweens, pen, ink, and paper. 22nd. I have had several letters from Arthur already. They are not long, but passing sweet, and just like himself, full of ardent affection and playful lively humour. But there is always a but in this imperfect world, and I do wish he would sometimes be serious. I cannot get him to write or speak in real solid earnest. I don't much mind it now, but if it will always be so, what shall I do with a serious part of myself? Chapter 23. First Weeks of Matrimony. February 18th, 1822. Early this morning, Arthur mounted his hunter and set off in high glee to meet the hounds. He will be away all day, and so I will amuse myself with my neglected diary, if I can give that name to such an irregular composition. It is exactly 4 months since I opened it last. I am married now, and settled down as Mrs. Huntington of Grassdale Manor. I've had 8 weeks' experience of matrimony, and do I regret the step I have taken? No, though I must confess in my secret heart that Arthur is not what I thought him at first, and if I had known him in the beginning as thoroughly as I do now, I probably never should have loved him, and if I had loved him first and then made the discovery, I fear I should have thought it my duty not to have married him. To be sure, I might have known him, for everyone was willing enough to tell me about him, and he himself was no accomplished hypocrite. But I was wilfully blind, and now, instead of regretting that I did not discern his full character before I was indissolubly bound to him, I am glad, for it has saved me a great deal of battling with my conscience and a great deal of consequent trouble and pain. And whatever I ought to have done, my duty now is plainly to love him and to cleave to him. And this just tallies with my inclination. He is very fond of me, almost too fond. I could do with less caressing and more rationality. I should like to be less of a pet and more of a friend, if I might choose. But I won't complain of that. I am only afraid his affection loses in depth where it gains in ardour. I sometimes liken it to a fire of dry twigs and branches, compared to one of solid coal, very bright and hot. But if it should burn itself out and leave nothing but ashes behind, what should I do? But it won't. It shan't. I'm determined, and surely I have power to keep it alive. So let me dismiss that thought at once. But Arthur is selfish, and I am constrained to acknowledge that, and indeed the admission gives me less pain than might be expected, for since I love him so much I can easily forgive him for loving himself. He likes to be pleased, and it's my delight to please him. And when I regret this tendency of his, it is for his own sake, not for mine. The first instance he gave was on the occasion of our bridal tour. He wanted to hurry it over, for all the continental scenes were already familiar to him. Many had lost their interest in his eyes, and others had never had anything to lose. The consequence was that after a flying transit through part of France and a part of Italy, I came back nearly as ignorant as I went, having made no acquaintance with persons and manners, and very little with things. My head swarming with a motley confusion of objects and scenes, some, it is true, leaving a deeper and more pleasing impression than others, but these embittered by the recollection that my emotions had not been shared by my companion, but that, on the contrary, when I had expressed a particular interest in anything that I saw or desired to see, it had been displeasing to him, inasmuch as it proved that I could take delight in anything disconnected with himself. As for Paris, we only just touched at that, and he would not give me time to see 1/10 of the beauties and interesting objects of Rome. He wanted to get me home, he said, to have me all to himself, and to see me safely installed as the mistress of Grassdale Manor, just as single-minded and naive and piquant as I was. And as if I had been some frail butterfly, he expressed himself fearful of rubbing the silver off my wings by bringing me into contact with society, especially that of Paris and Rome, and moreover he did not scruple to tell me that there were ladies in both those places that would tear his eyes out if they happened to meet him with me. Of course I was vexed at all this, but still it was less the disappointment to myself that annoyed me than the disappointment in him, and the trouble I was at to frame excuses to my friends for having seen and observed so little without imputing one particle of blame to my companion. But when we got home, to my new delightful home, I was so happy, and he was so kind, that I freely forgave him all, and I was beginning to think my lot too happy, and my husband actually too good for me, if not too good for this world, when, on the second Sunday after our arrival, he shocked and horrified me by another instance of his unreasonable exaction. We were walking home from the morning service, for it was a fine frosty day, and as we were so near to the church, I had requested the carriage should not be used. "Helen," said he, with unusual gravity, "I am not quite satisfied with you." I desired to know what was wrong. "But will you promise to reform it if I tell you?" "Yes, if I can, and without offending a higher authority." "Oh, there it is, you see. You don't love me with all of your heart." "I don't understand you, Arthur. At least I hope I don't. Pray tell me what I have done or said amiss." "It's nothing you've done or said. It's something that you are. You are too religious. Now, I like a woman to be religious, and I think your piety one of your greatest charms, but then, like all other good things, it may be carried too far. To my thinking, a woman's religion ought not to lessen her devotion to her earthly lord. She should have enough to purify and etherealize her soul, but not enough to refine away her heart and raise her above all human sympathies." "And am I above all human sympathies?" said I. "No, darling, but you're making more progress towards that saintly condition than I like. For all these 2 hours I've been thinking of you and wanting to catch your eye, and you are so absorbed in your devotions that you've not even a glance to spare for me. I declare it's enough to make one jealous of one's maker, which is very wrong, you know. So don't excite such wicked passions again, for my soul's sake." "I will give my whole heart and soul to my Maker if I can," I answered, "and not one atom more of it up to you than he allows. What are you, sir, that you should set yourself up as a god, and presume to dispute possession of my heart with him, to whom I own all I have and all I am, every blessing I ever did or can enjoy, and yourself among the rest, if you are a blessing, which I am half inclined to doubt?" "Don't be so hard upon me, Helen, and don't pinch my arm so. You're squeezing your fingers into the bone." "Arthur," continued I, relaxing my hold of his arm, "you don't love me half as much as I do you, and yet if you loved me far less than you do, I would not complain, provided you loved your Maker more. I should rejoice to see you at any time so deeply absorbed in your devotions than you had not a single thought to spare for me. But indeed I should lose nothing by the change, for the more you loved your God, the more deep and pure and true would be your love to me." At this he only laughed and kissed my hand, calling me a sweet enthusiast. Then taking off his hat, he added, "But look here, Helen, what can a man do with such a head as this?" The head looked right enough, but when he placed my hand on the top of it, it sunk into a bed of curls rather alarmingly low, especially in the middle. "You see, I was not made to be a saint," he said, laughing. "If God meant me to be religious, why didn't he give me the proper organ of veneration?" "You are like the servant," I replied, "who instead of employing his one talent in his master's service, restored it to him unimproved, alleging as an excuse that he knew him to be a hard man, reaping where he had not sown and gathering where he had not strawed. Of him to whom less is given, less will be required. But our utmost exertions are required of us all. You are not without the capacity of veneration, and faith, and hope, and conscience, and reason, and every other requisite to a Christian character, if you choose to employ them. But all our talents increasing in the using, and every faculty, both good and bad, strengthens by exercise. Therefore, if you choose to use the bad, or those which tend to evil, till they become your masters, and neglect the good till they dwindle away, you have only yourself to blame. But you have talents, Arthur, natural endowments, both of heart and mind and temper, such as many a better Christian would be glad to possess. If only you would employ them in God's service. I should never expect to see you a devotee, but it's quite possible to be a good Christian without ceasing to be a happy, merry-hearted man." "You speak like an oracle, Helen, and all you say is indisputably true. But listen here, I'm hungry, and I see before me a good substantial dinner. I'm told that if I abstain from this today, I shall have a sumptuous feast tomorrow, consisting of all manner of dainties and delicacies. Now, in the first place, I shall be loath to wait till tomorrow, when I have the means of appeasing my hunger already before me. In the second place, the solid viands of today are more to my taste than the dainties that are promised to me. In the third place, I don't see tomorrow's banquet, and how can I tell that it's not all fable, got up by the greasy-faced fellow that's advising me to abstain, in order that he may have all the good victuals to himself? In the fourth place, this table must be spread for somebody, and, as Solomon says, who can eat or who can hasten hereunto more than I? And finally, with your leave, I'll sit down and satisfy my cravings of today, and leave tomorrow to shift for itself. Who knows but what I may secure both this and that?" "But you are not required to abstain from the substantial dinner of today. You are only advised to partake of these coarser viands in such moderation as to not incapacitate you from enjoying the choicer banquet of tomorrow. If, regardless of that counsel, you choose to make a beast of yourself now, and overeat and overdrink yourself till you turn the good victuals into poison, who is to blame hereafter, while you are suffering the torments of yesterday's gluttony and drunkenness? You see more temperate men sitting down to enjoy themselves at that splendid entertainment which you are unable to taste." "Most true, my patron saint. But again, our friend Solomon says, there's nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and be merry." "And again," returned I, "he said, Rejoice, O young man, in thy youth, and walk in the ways of thine heart and in the sight of thine eyes. But know thou that for all these things God will bring thee into judgment." "Well, Helen, I'm sure I've been very good these last few weeks. What have you seen amiss in me, and what would you have me to do?" "Nothing more than you do, Arthur. Your actions are all right so far, but I would have your thoughts changed. I would have you to fortify yourself against temptation, and not to call evil good and good evil. I should wish you to think more deeply, to look farther and aim higher than you do." We now stood before our own door, and I said no more, but with an ardent and tearful embrace I left him, and went into the house, and upstairs to take off my bonnet and mantle. I wished to say nothing more on that subject at that time, lest I should disgust him with both it and me.
Okay, so remember how I said this week we were going to turn a corner? So Helen is not a little kid anymore. And I think the statement from Helen at the end of chapter 22, the one that I named this podcast episode after, when Helen realizes that Huntingdon simply does not have a serious side, and says, his letters are not long but passing sweet, and just like himself full of ardent affection and playful lively humor. But, and there's always a but in this imperfect world, I do wish he would sometimes be serious. I cannot get him to write or speak in real, solid earnest. I don't so much mind it now, but if it be always so, what shall I do with the serious part of myself? I mean, sure, it's a big old argument for not getting married too soon. Absolutely. But this also gets to the crux of part of what Anne Bronte witnessed back in 1830 that upset her so. And it was the not infantilized, but the infant men that she kept coming across. Men who couldn't be serious, who couldn't be grown-ups. Everything in these chapters are such an indictment of that kind of behavior. And even right now, her uncle, who appears to be a good and steady person who values grown-upness enough to at least have a home and estate that is working and not mortgaged to the hilt, is still nowhere near serious enough to have foreseen the consequences of what Helen was about to do the same way that her aunt saw it. It is also interesting that the people at the beginning of the book, way back when we had Gilbert and Mr. Lawrence and all of the people back in our framing story before we started reading Helen's diary, they had their strengths and their weaknesses, but the men weren't big old babies with a brandy bottle that they were sucking on. So we know that Anne Bronte is not indicting all of men everywhere, but she is definitely focusing on a particular subset of guys whose inactions greatly disturbed her. Now, it would be very easy to chalk this all up to what she saw happen to Branwell. And there is no question that she did see some of this behavior from him. Whether he was someone who had that kind of medicinal manic depressive behavior, and I say medicinal because I don't think this was a mental illness bipolar thing. I think this was a manic depressive like state brought about by the depressive quality of the alcohol and the manic spinning of an opiate. Whether Branwell was the one who was both taking laudanum and drinking at the same time or not, she certainly was aware of it. Some of this came from Lord Byron and things that happened in some of his poetry and his stories. Some of this was behavior that she witnessed, and some of this was picked up from her, as we mentioned before, reading in these ridiculous magazines that were very, very heavily laden with melodramatic turns of fate and drama. So, yes, Branwell, and he gets hit with this all the time, that the bad behavior in this book specifically is so Branwell. Yeah-ish. He didn't start out this way. And he certainly was aware of what he was doing to himself in a way that Huntingdon and Loughborough and Grimsby and Hargrave just don't. Whether it's because it's easier for them to have a good time if there is no skeleton at the feast, or if it's because they just seriously, who raised these people? They just don't know. We will probably be able to posit a theory on that in the not too near future. There were some moments where Anne Bronte was absolutely trying to make you shudder because of the way she had Huntingdon conflate religious statements, like bringing Loughborough back to being an id-driven baby sucking on a brandy bottle by saying, "I tenderly brought him back to the fold." That's supposed to hit you as, wow, that's way wrong. The visual metaphor of Annabella flirting with her gold-mounted whip. Okay, first off, a gold-mounted whip. Yikes. And kind of playing with that while holding the train of her writing habit while looking at herself in the mirror. We talk about Huntington hunting for prey. Boy, she's in a writing habit for the hunt, looking at herself, the lure, playing with a whip. We know who is controlling her relationship with Loughborough. And the final thing I will leave you with that should have made lots and lots of warning bells ring in your, as though the entire 3 chapters wasn't making warning bells go off. When they are walking home from church and discussing love, and Huntington basically wants Helen to become an idolater, to idolize him, to love him at least as much, if not more than, she loves God. That's a weird, disturbing mind, to be jealous of your spouse's love of, reverence for God. I mean, what kind of ego/id do you have to believe that you deserve? My brain absolutely reeled when I hit that part. This is also the part of the story where some reviewers start to have real problems with the text, and I have a different take on it. Up until this point, Helen has been very much a teenage girl in her diary section, not the part where she is an evident widow and referred to as Mrs. Graham, which, by the way, this does get explained how she's Huntington here and Mrs. Graham in the first part of the book. We saw her being a serious person at the beginning of the book, and we saw Gilbert's mother have some problems with her reactions to giving her child wine. I think you can see where this is now going pretty clearly after today's chapters. Where some of the criticism of the book happens is this switch that we see in these chapters, because she has gone from a fairly lighthearted teenage girl, girly girl, going to parties, wearing cute dresses, getting a crush on guys, all of that, to all of a sudden she's starting to sound a little bit like a religious zealot. Some people have said that this is an inconsistency in her personality, and I really strongly disagree. I think when confronted with someone who is so far the opposite, in order to try and pull them to the center, it is very understandable how you could yourself move way far in the opposite direction. And so if he had said positive things about her religion, her relationship to God, her beliefs, he had called her his angel and said, basically the upshot was, of course, I'll do whatever you tell me. You are my better angel. Now we're seeing that that's actually a much bigger problem than it seemed to be in the beginning. It's a much bigger problem than even Helen's aunt thought it was. Her servant, Rachel, didn't get a chance to tell her what was being discussed in the servants' hall. It would have been so interesting to be a fly on the wall for those conversations. But one of the things we talked about last night on the chat that I wanted to bring up here was the earlier chapter where Helen's aunt tried to soberly talk her down from her infatuation and get her to think seriously about the rest of her life. That's one chapter that teenagers, both, as Amy said, both boys and girls, should listen to. These chapters are so telling, and it's so easy to see how what seemed innocuous and just kind of charming and fun in Huntington's character before being married to him, after their honeymoon, their tour, being as random and unpleasant as it was, all the way up through this story of how Huntington and his friends pulled Lord Loughborough back into dangerous for his health, dangerous for his future, dangerous for his family's history, all of that pulled him back into that bad behavior. And I think Anne Bronte did such a great job of showing how that kind of peer pressure works, that it didn't take anyone going to Loughborough's residence and saying, "Come on, man, come out and drink with us. One's not going to hurt you." No. They waited until he showed the tiniest bit of interest. And then they just quietly kept pushing more at him. And he was miserable and he wanted to have fun. Of course he wanted to have fun. Who doesn't want to have fun? But he couldn't just have a little. He clearly had a problem, both with gambling and with drinking and laudanum. I don't think it's a bad idea to have a conversation with teenagers about that section. And if you saw somebody doing that, if you saw somebody gently encouraging behavior that you and they know is self-destructive or just destructive, how do you deal with that? It's really hard. It's really complicated. It's really tricky. And it's something that needs to be talked about. The corollary to that is, as I said on the call last night, when I was teaching, it became really clear that girls that other girls don't trust, guys should probably be careful and pay attention, especially if you have friends who are smart girls and you're really into some girl that it's not that they don't like her, it's that they don't trust her. That's a really good indicator that you probably shouldn't either. And girls, if you're all hot and after a guy and your guy friends who are smart, who you can trust, are pulling back and saying, yeah, maybe be careful. You should be careful who we're attracted to and who we think is hot and who makes us laugh. We can't necessarily control that hormonal side of things, but learning how to give yourself time to let your brain catch up to your hormones, which Helen, had she had more time without access to Huntington, totally would have been able to do. Certainly if she had had more time to hear some stories, maybe get around to listening to Rachel, she would have, she's not stupid, she would have figured this out. And it would have stunk. And she probably would have still had a flutter in her heart and stomach every time she saw or thought about Huntington. But she probably wouldn't have married him. And honestly, whatever it was that Huntington saw in her that he was interested in hunting, whether it was her ignoring him and therefore in his mind making it a hunt, a chase, or whatever, he may have gotten bored and left and gone off to some other prey and saved her the trouble. Certainly if she had been removed from his presence for long enough and he hadn't had access to go up hunting with her uncle, he would have found somebody else. And that didn't happen. And here we are, and we're stuck. A couple of quick things on COVID-19. If you are interested in the research that is going on into the disease, because of course, back in January and February, it was a new disease. It was novel. It was new. It's a novel coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, also known as COVID-19 because it was discovered in 2019. The University of California, San Francisco does fairly regular webinars on the research that's being done. Those are presented on YouTube. They are free. They are available. They are webinars, but they're very well done so that you can see the human person speaking and you can also see their slides. They speak as medical people, so they don't sugarcoat it and they don't baby it and talk down to you. You are expected to keep up. For the most part, I don't think anyone who has gotten through high school science will have a problem with it. But I think it's particularly useful to watch this with high school age kids because of one specific thing. When they do science in school, they are given experiments that are set up to achieve a specific result. That is not real science. That is fun, and it gives you an opportunity to see the kind of things that scientists do. And it gives you an opportunity, if you have a very good teacher, to see, kind of at a distance, the scientific process. moving from hypothesis to results. In real life, we are watching science happen in front of us all over the world. Back in February, I remember there being a discussion about whether very similar to the way that AIDS was first discussed. Can you get it from touching a doorknob that somebody with COVID-19 touched? We knew it wasn't a bloodborne illness, so we knew it wasn't like HIV, but we didn't know, does somebody have to cough on you? Does the virus stay in the air? So if somebody just coughs or breathes or sneezes into the air, does the virus stay kind of hovering in like a dust mote in the air? We didn't know. We know a lot more now. And that's because a lot of time, money, effort, and manpower, women power, science power has been pushed onto figuring this sucker out. There's so much research being done. And God bless the internet, that research is being shared amongst the scientists doing the research, which is what makes it go faster, the same way that the development of the personal computer, when a bunch of super smart guys were in their garages sharing their insights, the new results that they got from stuff that they were playing around with, monkeying around with, that got us personal computers much faster than we would have otherwise. Same thing's happening here, which is great, but it also makes it feel like it keeps changing. And it's not the virus necessarily that keeps changing, although it might be, because viruses do mutate. What is changing is the amount of information that we now understand. So, UCSF, University of California, San Francisco, COVID webinars, super good. The other thing is New York is about 70% ramped up. Pennsylvania is starting to ramp up on contact tracing. I am not sure where any of the other states are at when it comes to contact tracing, but I can tell you this. If this is something that you are interested in doing, if you are out of work, if you would really rather work from home, if you are interested in science, in COVID, in giving back in some small way by working in contact tracing, there is a 6-hour-ish long course where you can either read the transcript or you can watch a series of videos and then take little quizzes afterwards. They are not punitive. You can take the quizzes as many times as you want until you get, I think you have to get 80 or 85% on each quiz before you can move on to the next bit. When you get to the end of the roughly 6 hours of training, there is a test. You can take the test twice. I think you have to get 85 on that. You can take the test twice on the same day, and then if you still haven't passed it after that, I think you have to wait, I think it's 24 hours, and then you can take it again. They have some restrictions on how frequently you can take the test, because obviously they would want you to go back and review whatever you're missing, and they do show you. It's not like it's a mystery what you blew. They want you to know these things and get them right on the test. So it's very low stress. It's all multiple choice. You guys know the trick about multiple choice questions, right? We've talked about this before. Read the question stem, read the question, and then cover with your hand or hide somehow the answer choices so that you don't see what the 4 options are. Read that question stem, come up with the answer in your own mind, and then look at the choices, and you'll see one of them is either exactly what you came up with or close, and that's the one you go with. So that's the easy way to not overthink a multiple choice test. That's Kaplan training right there is what that is. If you do this Johns Hopkins University contact tracing course, at the very, very end, you get a certificate. Download that sucker, print that sucker, share that sucker to your LinkedIn account page. The recruiters who are trying to ramp up Pennsylvania pinged me within 24 hours of me posting that I had finished and passed and gotten the certificate for the Johns Hopkins University contact tracing course, looking to see if I wanted to work for the state. When I did this in early May with a different contact tracing program, also good, but not nearly as in-depth as the Johns Hopkins one. And that one came from ASTHO, the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials. And that one was called Making Contact, a Training for COVID-19 Contact Tracers. When I posted on LinkedIn that I got that certificate back in May, early May, nothing happened. That's because nothing was happening. So it's happening now. So if you're interested, highly recommend, even if it's free right now. It's a Coursera course and it's free right now. Even if you are just taking it so that you know more, so that you can demystify friends and family, I really seriously highly recommend the Johns Hopkins course. So good, so useful. And University of California, San Francisco, COVID stuff. Tara Worsterwaite on Ravelry, who you have heard from many times, her husband came down with COVID-19. He tested positive for it. Their story is very interesting and not what you would expect. And I think the secret answer to all of that is, with COVID, expect the unexpected, because everybody's body is dealing with it differently. And that is why things like cytokine storms are happening. And if you don't know what a cytokine storm is, you can go to the show notes at craftlit.com/529 and follow the link to learn about cytokine storms, because that's when it starts to make sense why COVID is leaving people with such different, well, giving them such different symptoms, but also leaving them with such different repercussions to deal with. It's rough stuff, man. Not a joke. All right. That was a ton. I'm sorry about that, but I had to get you through the end of this chapter, because now from here on out, I think you know what we're up against. And again, this was written in 1848. We just don't learn. All right, to cheer yourself up, go look at the list of books from the Tuesday and Thursday chats so that you can find something fun, like Happy Family, a book translated from the original German book by David Safir, Sarah in Finland. So excited about that book. Thank you. Happy Family, go look at the Goodreads page. You will crack up and then try and find a copy of the translation. All right. You take care, be well, stay well, keep those around you well. We wear our masks to keep everyone else safe. Take care. Talk to you soon. Bye. A big thanks to all the Craftlit listeners who support the show by being a premium audio member via craftlit.com/premium or via patreon.com/craftlit. Your support for the show is what's kept us going since 2006. If you feel like getting free audio pretty much every week, please consider supporting the show by heading over to patreon.com/craftlit and pledging what you feel the show is worth to you. If you can't support the show that way, consider leaving a review at iTunes or at our facebook.com/craftlit page, or follow @craftlit on Twitter and share the show with your followers too. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.